Instead, people in this space need to recognize increasing balance in the way they try to exercise their rights and less control. To leave the space open, recognizing that this is a culture that you can't control without destroying the culture you're trying to encourage. So that's one change in us. Finally, the second change. We all need to practice balance in the way in which we deploy and create our own work. And this was the purpose behind the launching 6 years ago of this project, the Creative Commons project. So Creative Commons was launched to give a simple way to authors to mark their content with the freedoms they intended to carry. So rather than the traditional all rights reserved, this is a kind of some rights reserved model, where an author gets to signal the freedoms that others have while signaling the freedoms that the author reserves to himself. So for example, using Creative Commons licenses, you can signal the freedom to share or the freedom to remix the work or both, subject to some limits. You can say only for non-commercial purposes, or you can say only if you share alike, only if you give others the same freedom with the work that you have produced, or both. You select the freedoms and the limits and you get a license. Actually, there are 6 possible licenses. Some that simply require attribution, some that restrict commercial use and require that you make no changes to the underlying work. These licenses come in 3 separate layers. One layer is a human-readable Commons deed, designed to be understandable by anybody to express the freedoms associated with the license. So you click on the icon and this is the first information you receive. Then linked to this Commons deed is a very different document, a lawyer-readable license, a 1 billion-page document written by the best lawyers we could find to make enforceable the freedoms associated with the content. And then thirdly, and very importantly, attached to every license is the machine-readable expression of the freedoms associated with the license so that search engines and computers can begin to interpret content on the basis of the freedoms given with that content. So my favorite example of how this actually works comes from this song written by a man named Colin Mutchler, a guitarist and activist, which he released titled My Life on the internet in a Creative Commons licensed context. It was downloaded by a 17-year-old violinist named Cora Beth, who added the violin track you hear on top. She renamed the song, My Life Changed, and then circulated it on the net so that there have been at least 20 that I've discovered other remixes of this hauntingly beautiful music. Now, all of this creativity, my colleagues find hard to understand, was done with these artists never meeting each other, never even speaking to each other, consistent with the law of copyright, without any lawyer standing in the middle. And that's the objective of the project, to make it possible for people to respect the underlying rules of copyright, while using digital technologies to create in a way that this platform begs us to create. Now, after we launched this project in 2002, we've seen an extraordinary growth in the number of licenses, more than 150 million objects now licensed in this context. Licenses in the context of, for example, Flickr, which has over 100 million images now licensed under the Creative Commons licenses. Artists such as John Coltrane, who have released his work under the license. 9 Inch Nails, which released an album under a Creative Commons license and generated $1.6 million in revenues for that album within the first week. Even Al Jazeera now has a Creative Commons repository of film from the struggles inside the Middle East that's available for anybody to download and to use in their news reporting for commercial purposes as well as for non-commercial purposes. And making me most proud, perhaps, is the fact that the White House, under Barack Obama, now releases all user-generated content under a Creative Commons license and all content produced by the government into the public domain. That's the objective here of Creative Commons. And the focus that I want you to think of finally in the context of this talk tonight is to think about what that set of tools could mean in the context of a museum. For example, a museum that has something as beautiful as this to offer its visitors. Because the tradition of museums, especially in the context of the 20th century, it's a tradition of read-only museums. Museums that ask people to come in and consume, but not to touch, not to get near, not to try to change, not to comment upon, not to alter in any respect at all the art which they are consuming. But if we recognize that we are birthing a generation that depends upon the opportunity to engage, then museums need to think about how they will become read-write museums. Not museums that allow people to spray paint the Mona Lisa, that's not what I'm talking about, but museums that invite people to learn about the past by engaging with it. And we will encourage people to engage if they are free to engage, if they are encouraged to engage through signals like Creative Commons licenses that say, you are free to share and to remix and to learn about this tradition legally. And the fact that they can do it legally means that schools will be able to teach this as well as institutions support it. It's an architecture for a museum that invites the museum to begin a conversation and become a focal point for that conversation. To invite people into this space to begin a talk which continues long after they have left. That's the changes in us. That's the end of the argument. Let me make one more point before I stop. So, I was invited to come speak at this place. This is the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. It's a grand room with these red velvet curtains and red carpet. This was an event organized by the Bar Association for the purpose of explaining to people the law of fair use. So the room was packed with artists and creators and some lawyers, all of whom were eager to understand how they could create consistent with the American law of fair use. Well, fair use has 4 factors that you have to consider in deciding whether your use is a fair use. And so the Bar Association had the brilliant idea that they would ask 4 lawyers to speak 15 minutes each. And at the end of 60 minutes, they believed they would have an audience that was perfectly schooled in the law of fair use, who would understand exactly how they could create consistent with the law. But as I sat there and looked out in the audience, by about minute 45, the look was more like this, not a look of understanding. And that led me to a certain kind of daydreaming, as I was trying to remember what exactly this room reminded me of. And when I was a kid, I spent an extraordinary amount of time traveling through a part of the world that was at that point cut off, the former Soviet Union. And I began to think that this room actually was reminding me a lot of this room. And as I thought about that room, I began to think to myself, when was it in the history of the Soviet Republic when you could convince people in the Soviet system that the Soviet system had failed? When was it? I mean, 76 was too early. It was pretty much puttering along and working okay in 76. 1989 was too late. If you didn't understand in 1989, you were never going to understand that the system was a failure. So when was it between 76 and 89 that you could have convinced people the system was going to fail? And more importantly, what could you have said to them to convince them that this grand romantic ideal that they or their parents had fought for had crashed and burned, and to continue with the Soviet system would be to betray a certain kind of insanity? Because when I listen to lawyers talk about copyright in the digital age, lawyers like us in the United States, people who insist nothing has changed, the same rules apply, it's the pirates who are the deviants. Well, they might be right about that, but as they insist that the system putter along in the same way that it has and ever has, I recognize that it is we who are insane.